Okay, so let's continue our discussion about animal form and function. This is the slide that I finished off with in class. Just to remind you, we were talking about different forms of muscle tissue. And this is skeletal muscle or voluntary muscle, also known as striated muscle because it is so prominently striated. There are other muscle types where you can see some striation, but skeletal muscle has very prominent striations. The cells are composed of joined cells which are joined together without cross walls. And they have the nuclei here on the side here. So this is effectively the cytoplasm of the cell, packed with microtubules, which are and material which is responsible for the contractions of the muscle, organized in such a way that these striations are quite obvious. So this is skeletal, striated, voluntary muscle. The other kinds of muscle are smooth muscle, which is involuntary muscle. That is the muscle which is present, for example, in the walls of the blood vessels, in the bladder, in the walls of reproductive tract, etc., which is not under voluntary control, but rather is under control of the involuntary nervous system. Sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems control the activity of smooth muscle. Some of the smooth muscle undergoes regular contractions. For example, the contraction of smooth muscle in the gut, which is still under nervous control. Other smooth muscle is relaxed until it is actually stimulated by the nervous system. So this is smooth muscle, and smooth muscle consists of individual spindle-shaped fibers that without, it's very, very difficult to discern any striations or organization of the tubules inside. So they are non-striated. Cardiac muscle is a very, very specialized form of muscle fiber. The cells bear some relation to the skeletal muscle in that you can see faint striations, and also there are relatively few cross walls, but there are some very distinct joins between the fibers, which you can see here. They're called the intercalated discs, and the muscle fibers contract against those. So they pull, when the muscle contracts, it pulls the intercalated discs towards one another. They have very prominent nuclei, but the most distinctive feature of cardiac muscle is that the fibers are branched, and they link, all of the fibers are linked by those branches. Cardiac muscle has a strange property, which is that it generates its own contraction. Its contractions are not under control of the nervous system in any way, the way that skeletal and smooth muscle are. But the cardiac muscle generates its own contractions and then relaxes. If you look at a culture of cardiac cells, you can actually see them twitching in this way. And they of course, make up the heart. And under circumstances where the heart is just left alone, the cardiac cells actually contract in an uncoordinated fashion. And the contraction of the cardiac muscle cells is coordinated by small electrical impulses generated by other parts of the heart called the pacemaker. The pacemaker system coordinates the beating of cardiac muscle cells into the heart, into the organized heartbeat. And if that coordination is lost, then the heart just simply twitches in an unproductive manner, which we call a fibrillation. So those are the three kinds of muscle that we can. The fourth kind of tissue that we need to talk about, we'll only mention briefly here because we're going to discuss it in some detail later on in the semester. And that is nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is highly specialized to receive and process and then transmit information of many different kinds. There is a basic form to the nerve cell that it has a cell body of some sort with a nucleus and complex cytoplasm, but it then has extensions, and those extensions may carry information from the cell body to other nerve cells, to muscles, to glands, etc. So here we see, for example, here is the cell body of a nerve cell. You can just make out the nucleus here, and then there is there is one very long extension, which is called the nerve axon. And here, fine extensions, which you can see coming out, which are called the dendrites. Here it is receiving information via the dendrites, processing and transmitting information via the axon. And then at the end here, it will be communicating with some other kind of cell. So the nervous tissue, when we look at something like the brain or the spinal cord, we see a mixture of cell types, many different kinds of neuron, which are processing and transmitting the nerve impulses, but then many supporting cells. And those are called the glial cells, or the glia. And they perform many different functions, which we'll hear about later on in this semester. The nervous tissue itself consists of those two types of cells. The nerve cells themselves may be organized into bundles, which we recognize as, we colloquially refer to them as the nerves. So for example, if you look at the spine, you'll see thick bundles of nerve cells leaving the spine, and those we refer to as the spinal nerves. But remember that those are in fact made up of neurons, of actual nerve cells themselves. So the principal function of the nervous system, of course, is to coordinate and to control the entire organism. And there are two parallel systems in a way which do so, which provide such coordination and control. The first is the nervous system. The second is the endocrine system, a system of hormones, of actual chemical control. These two systems, although they are structured so very differently to one another, they bear strong similarities to one another in the way in which they work. So, for example, they both respond to stimuli. In the endocrine system, we have systems which are actually able to perceive an environmental stimulus. And in response to that stimulus, both systems produce a response. In the case of the endocrine system, the response is to produce chemicals, which are called the hormones, which go into circulation in the body and which have a result distant from the place where they are originated. So, for example, in response to changes in the temperature, let's say, there are cells in an area of the brain called the hypothalamus, which will release hormones, which may stimulate other organs to release their own hormones, which eventually get the body to produce a response. So in case of temperature, for example, the hypothalamus may pick up that the temperature is dropping, release hormones which end up causing muscles to begin to shiver and generate heat. That it would be a typical stimulus, falling temperature, with a response, the shivering, which is produced by these messengers, the hormones. The nervous system works in a somewhat analogous way, although it does it through an entirely different cell structure system. So, for example, the nerve cells may receive a stimulus. We have nerve cells which can perceive pain, heat, cold, etc., etc., etc. Those nerve cells, in response to such a stimulus, will produce a response which is a nerve impulse. that nerve impulse can be transmitted over very, very long distances through the organism. In our case, for example, we can stub your toe and you have a pain stimulus, which is perceived by your brain and interpreted. And a response, the nervous system then produces a response of some kind. Then this response produced in response to a nerve impulse can be of varying kinds. So, for example, we might have the nerve impulse causing a muscle to respond, to contract. The nerve impulse may impinge on a gland and cause a gland to start releasing substances, etc., etc. So in both cases, what is happening is a stimulus is being received and some distant response is produced by an intermediary system, which has its own responses. All of these are designed to continually monitor both the external and the internal environment of the organism, and to maintain, as far as possible, to maintain relatively constant internal conditions. That is called homeostasis. That is homeostasis is the maintenance of relatively constant conditions, internal conditions, so that the organism is always operating under optimal conditions. And one of the important mechanisms whereby homeostasis is maintained is that both the endocrine and the nervous system monitor the internal environment. And even if conditions do change, there are many organisms are able to alter their internal environment to try and maintain a constant environment. So organisms which can do that, which can regulate internal control mechanisms, or regulate internal conditions by internal control mechanisms, are called regulators. But there are many organisms which aren't able to do that. And instead, they simply are at the mercy of their environment. And often you'll find that those organisms still maintain conditions within acceptable limits, but they often do it by things like behavioral responses. Now, so we can use this example. These two organisms, the otter and a fish, these are both aquatic organisms, right? They spend a lot of time in water. The fish all the time in the water, otters a lot of the time in the water. So they are subject to somewhat similar environmental pressures, especially as far as temperature is concerned. But the otter is able to generate its own heat. It is able to internally generate and shepherd its temperature to maintain a relatively constant body temperature. So the river otter is a temperature regulator. And the fish, on the other hand, is at the mercy of its environment. It is called a conformer because it has no means of maintaining a constant body temperature. It ends up conforming to the environmental temperature. And if it wants to maintain a particular body temperature, it has to move into an environment where the temperature is suitable. But a conformer very often has a very, very wide range of tolerance. They certainly have optimal conditions under which they operate, but they are often very much more tolerant of a wide range of conditions. So, for example, fish may become at very low temperatures. Simply, their metabolism slows to such an extent that they become essentially inactive, but they survive at that temperature until the temperature rises sufficiently high that they can become active again. So this maintenance of homeostasis is one of the most important aspects of being a complex organism. And in many cases where organisms are able to regulate, where they are regulated, they are responding to changes in around an optimum point, which we regard as being a set point. So, for example, our body temperature is about 37 degrees Celsius, and that is a set point which our body monitors constantly. Likewise, we have an optimum level of glucose in our blood, which our body monitors constantly. And if we vary from that optimum, then the body responds in such a way as restores the conditions to that set point. We can use an analogy, and that is of if we have a heating cooling system in our homes, and we set the temperature at a particular point. Let's say it's 20 degrees Celsius. If the temperature rises above 20 degrees Celsius, then there is a response. So we have some sort of sensor, and the sensor senses that the temperature has risen, and the response is to switch an air conditioner on. The air conditioner now runs and lowers the temperature, and it lowers it to the set point. But if it runs too far, it runs too hard, and it begins to lower the room temperature, then the room temperature falls below the set point, and there is a response. The thermostat now turns the heat on and raises the temperature and raises it up to the set point. If it goes below the set point, then if it goes above the set point, then the air conditioner switches on. If it goes below the set point, then the heat comes on. And between the two systems, generating heat and controlling the heat, the set point is maintained. It will bounce around and around that until it establishes a normal mean. And our body systems of maintaining homeostasis operate in much the same way. We have two systems really that we can discern. The first is a system referred to as negative feedback, and that is a system which dampens a stimulus. And is by far the most important of all of the control mechanisms. Let's say, for example, we return to our example of heating and cooling. We have an optimum, which is around about 37 degrees Celsius. Our body temperature is actually monitored, as I'll show you in a minute, by an area of the brain. And in monitoring, if the temperature is seen to vary away from that set point of 37 degrees, then there is a response, a set of responses which the body can operate. If, for example, we enter an environment where the temperature is much higher than 37 degrees, and our body temperature begins to rise, or if we exercise very hard and we generate a lot of heat in the body, then the brain actually sees that our body temperature is rising above 37, and it sets off a series of involuntary responses. And those are cooling mechanisms, such as sweating, for example. When we sweat, we produce liquid which pools on the surface of the skin. It requires a lot of heat in order to get that to evaporate. And as it evaporates, it carries that heat away and effectively cools us. In animals, it may stimulate panting, which is a very important cooling mechanism because many animals lack surface sweat glands, and instead they cool by cooling the mucous membranes of the mouth by panting. When you do that, when you start those cooling mechanisms, then the body temperature begins to decrease. If the body temperature should then decrease below 37 degrees Celsius, then the body switches, then the brain causes a set of heat generating mechanisms to start operating. For example, if we become very cold, then we start to shiver. Shivering is a form of rapid muscle contraction, which doesn't actually produce useful movement, but it generates a tremendous amount of heat. We'll find out that there are actually some other really complex mechanisms for warming, but the net effect is we begin to raise the temperature, and the brain picks up that the temperature is approaching 37 degrees Celsius. If it goes over, it'll cool. If it cools too much, it will start warming, and we end up maintaining a body temperature around about 37 degrees Celsius relatively constantly. This is a system of negative feedback. That is in response each time we have produced a response. In what happens is that response is dampened. It is with a dampening mechanism is the response of the sensor. That is negative feedback. But there are some systems of positive feedback as well. And positive feedback mechanisms are less common, but they actually amplify a stimulus. So they don't play a major part in homeostasis, but they're interesting nonetheless. There are two which are really classic examples. The first is that the process of labor to give birth to an infant operates under a system of positive feedback. As contractions, as muscle fiber is stretched, and then as contractions begin, there is actually a process where the brain releases a hormone called oxytocin, which causes the uterus to contract. As the uterus contracts, it causes more oxytocin to be released until such time as the birth actually has taken place, when the uterus no longer is stimulated to contract. So that's the one. The other instance also associated with an infant is in breastfeeding. Breast milk is released in response to contraction of smooth muscle in the breast. And when for various stimuli, visual stimuli of an infant wanting to feed, tactile stimuli of the infant actually feeding, causes the brain to release oxytocin. And as oxytocin is released, the muscles in the breast contract and move the milk. As that happens, the brain picks up the stimulus from the breast itself and releases more oxytocin. So that is another positive feedback mechanism. Okay, so you will have gathered by the fact that I've referred to it several times that the regulation of temperature is one of our most important homeostatic mechanisms. So there are two groups of animals. They're not actually, I should tell you right away, but they are not as strict groupings as we might think. I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But in general, we regard animals which are able to generate heat by metabolism and budget that heat as being endothermic. Now, all animals generate heat by metabolism. It is a byproduct of the metabolic processes. Metabolic processes are relatively inefficient, and some of the energy that is involved in the metabolic reactions is lost as heat. That's the law of thermodynamics, that no change in energy status is ever 100% efficient. Some energy is always lost as heat. But the endothermic animals are actually able to manipulate that heat, the metabolic heat. They're able to use it to maintain homeostasis. Ectothermic animals are not able to do so. They only, or they can do, if they can do it, they can only do it within very limited circumstances. And I'll give you some examples. The ectothermic animals are what in common parlance are referred to as being cold-blooded. What that actually means is they are conformers. Their body temperature is largely the same as the environment. Now, in the endothermic animals, they maintain a constant body heat by the sorts of mechanisms that I've already mentioned, under strict control of the nervous system. There are systems to raise body temperature or lower it to maintain it within certain range. The ectothermic animals largely lack that ability. Now, I say largely because there are some ectothermic animals which are actually able to generate heat on and budget it on a certain limited basis. Most things like the fish, amphibians, reptiles, most invertebrates, these are strictly conformers. They are ectothermic, but there are some fishes, for example, the tuna, many of the oceanic fishes, which need to swim fast and constantly, are able to generate heat in their muscles and maintain that heat in the muscles. So they're not strictly completely ectothermic, but they are not endothermic in that they maintain a global temperature, constant temperature. So there are advantages and disadvantages to both systems. The advantage for the endothermic animals is that their metabolism stays at a constant level. They are able to be active, maintain similar levels of activity no matter what the environmental temperature. Ectothermic animals, which are conformers, are at the mercy of their environmental temperature, and their metabolic rate drops as the temperature drops. So they still have the optimum temperatures at which they operate best, they survive best, but they are only able to maintain those conditions by behavioral means. So, for example, reptiles will regulate their body temperature very closely to within certain levels, but they will do it by behavioral means, by moving in and out of the sun, for example, by burying themselves, that sort of thing. Whereas an endothermic animal can move in many different environments and in many different environmental temperatures, but because they have those regulatory mechanisms, they keep a constant internal body temperature. There's a disadvantage, and that is that these systems of endothermy are actually metabolically very, very expensive. We are constantly burning energy to maintain our body temperature, whereas the ectothermic animals do not have to do so, and they have a very low metabolic overhead that they have to pay. They don't need as much food, for example, and their internal systems are very, very tolerant of a wide range of temperatures without being damaged. Their overall activity may fall as the temperature falls, but they are not actually damaged, where endothermic animals may actually find low temperatures imposed on them as being lethal. So there are advantages and disadvantages to the two systems. So in the endotherms, particularly, there are a number of different mechanisms whereby they thermoregulate. Some of these also apply to the ectotherms, and I'll point out where they are. First of all, endotherms very frequently have extensive insulating mechanisms. That is why, for example, the mammals evolved hair. That's why the birds evolved feathers. Those were evolved as thermoregulatory mechanisms. They are insulators. They limit the amount of heat which is lost from the body surface. In other animals, there is a layer of fat right underneath the skin for exactly the same reason that we see in things like marine organisms like the seals and the whales that we call blubber. And the blubber actually has two major functions in aquatic organisms. The first is its principal function is thermoregulatory. It's an insulator. The second thing is the blubber is actually a flotation mechanism. Fat is much less dense than the rest of the body tissues. The second set of adaptations are circulatory adaptations, and that is to regulate the amount of body fluid which is flowing through the circulatory system between the external, the skin and the extremities, for example, and the internal part of the body where the organs lie, and in particular the brain. These are referred to as the body core. And many of our principal thermoregulatory mechanisms lie in communication between the external, the surface blood vessels, etc., and the blood vessels of the core. So, for example, we possess areas of our body which actually actively radiate heat, and those are our hands and our faces. Feet to a certain extent, but not nearly as much as hands. And the blood vessels in our face and in our hands are modified so that they respond to changes in temperature under instruction from the brain. The brain picks up the internal body temperature, the core temperature. And if we need to lose heat, the blood vessels in the hands and in the face dilate so that more blood flows through the surface and heat is radiated out. If we're placed in a situation where the body temperature, core temperature begins to fall, then those blood vessels contract. And they decrease in volume and they direct more blood to the core so that more blood circulates in the core and is maintained at a higher temperature. I'll show you one other system in a minute, which is tremendously important in aquatic organisms, which is also a circulatory adaptation. So the third mechanism whereby we control temperature is by evaporative heat loss. And this depends on the fact that water has a very, very high specific heat. It requires a tremendous amount of energy to get water to change its state, first from solid to liquid, and then from liquid to gas. And it's the liquid to gas that is of greatest interest to us. You have to put in a tremendous amount of heat into water in order to get it to evaporate. And when it then evaporates, it takes that heat away with it to stay in the gaseous state. And that is the principal reason why we sweat, as I've explained before. There are other mechanisms actually involving water, which we can see in various animals. For a start, that is one of the reasons why we find it so pleasurable to go swimming when it's very hot. That is a behavioral adaptation which many, many animals adopt. They will go into water and then come out when it's extremely hot, so that the evaporating water carries heat away from their surface. And that is something you'll see in many different animals. Okay, so just let me explain. I said that there was this circulatory mechanism which I thought you should know about, and this is a very, very common system. It's called a counter current exchange system. Okay, so now picture this. I'm going to talk specifically about animals which are in cold environments, which have, for example, extremities, which need to be in that cold environment. So we can think, for example, of birds like the geese, penguins, these kinds of animals, where they have the rest of the body here is insulated and has a high core temperature. But they have these extremities which are in very, very cold environments. And we might think that what would happen would be that the blood obviously has to circulate through the feet, etc. It would get very, very cold. You'd lose a tremendous amount of heat to the environment. And then this very cold blood would go back into the core and begin to cool the core down, but also would require a tremendous amount of energy to heat it back up again. So this would be a very disadvantageous situation. But here's what actually happens. It's really essentially a very simple system. And that is that the arteries, which are carrying the hot blood from the core away from the core, are run very, very close to the veins, which are carrying blood from the extremity towards the core. And the result is that, for example, here's the blood flowing, just leaving the body, entering the limb at 35 degrees Celsius. And we're going to watch it cool down, cool down, cool down, but it is not losing its heat to the environment. It's transmitting heat to blood, which is in the vein, which is moving up like this. So that what it is doing is it is warming the blood. Instead of wasting the heat to the environment, it is warming the blood, which is being returned to the body. It's actually a very, very efficient system. And by the time the blood reaches the core, it is not that much cooler than the blood which is just leaving the core. You'll see it's important, though, to note that it is a little bit lower, because that is what maintains this heat flow across. Okay. This blood here is cooler, and it is warmed by the blood flowing in this. This is the typical countercurrent system. And at its simplest, all it is you run the two vessels, the afferent and the efferent vessel, right up against one another. And in fact, in some systems, they become to form a complex net. This is what we have in systems, in organisms like the whales and the dolphins. In their flippers, the vessels actually form a complex net like this, so that the same countercurrent system operates. This is called a rete mirabile, and it has exactly the same effect. We see that the blood returning to the body from the flippers is not that much lower in temperature than the core temperature, because all of the heat has been conserved. Okay, so here are some other mechanisms. Behavioral responses are very, very important, and those here is one area where we see that even the ectotherms are able to maintain and manage their body temperature. There are several examples. In insects, it is very common to see shivering, and it's exactly the same principle as in the endotherms. Insects shiver in order to generate heat in their muscles. You'll often see, for example, you just sit and watch bees as they feed, especially in the cooler weather like in spring and fall. Watch them feed, and you'll see that immediately before they set flight, they will shiver for a time. What they're doing is they're raising their metabolic rate. By shivering, they're raising their temperature, raising their metabolic rate, preparatory to flying. But they can also cool themselves by various mechanisms. This is a dragonfly. In heat, they will raise their bodies like this so that there is circulation of air around the body and cooling of the body. Under cooler conditions, what they will do is they will lie flat against a surface to prevent loss of heat. But by far the most important mechanism is actually to generate heat under various conditions and to control the generation of heat. So what animal organisms are able to do is adjust their metabolic heat production. The principal way in which this is done is by thermogenesis, by actually producing heat usually under hormonal control. So there are two ways to do this. The first is called shivering thermogenesis. And that is a response that we all know. When we get cold, we begin to shiver. Our muscles move without producing useful movement, but they raise their metabolic rate and they generate heat. And that heat is conserved inside the body. Often that shivering is sufficient to raise the body temperature to the normal homeostatic level, in our case, 37 degrees Celsius. But there is also a whole system called non-shivering thermogenesis. And this depends upon the mobilization of our fuel resources. There are two sets of fuel resources that are principally involved in non-shivering thermogenesis, and they are yellow fat and brown fat. Yellow fat is seldom actually used in non-shivering thermogenesis. It is much more difficult to mobilize, but some of it will be used under very cold circumstances. But there is another type of fat which is much more available for use in generating heat, and this is called brown fat. It's brown because it is packed tight with mitochondria. It's not very common in mammals such as the human. We do have a small amount. It's laid down here in the clavicle area and around your shoulders here. So we do have a little bit. Other animals have far more, and it tends to be very much more common in the small mammals, which are much more subject to cooling because they have a relatively high surface area compared to their size. In non-shivering thermogenesis, the mitochondria are stimulated to burn that brown fat and simply to generate heat. It was actually this, the existence of brown fat in human beings was only relatively recently demonstrated, but it performs exactly the same function in humans. It is burned under cold conditions to generate heat. So that, okay, so all of these systems are maintained, especially in the endotherms, which is so important. These are referred to as bioenergetics. And bioenergetics is the study of the flow and the transformation of energy in an animal. And it is the bioenergetics of an organism which determine an animal's nutritional needs, for example. And we find that it is related to size, to activity, and then thirdly to the environment that the organism is living in. A reminder, we are heterotrophs. All animals are heterotrophs. They harvest all of their chemical energy from food, but they're still dependent on environmental energy in that, for example, they have optimal temperature regimes which are imposed by the environment. So there is a certain basic metabolic rate which has to do with simple maintenance of the living condition of the cell. It doesn't, I first will say, it doesn't matter what size the organism is. Basically, all organisms, their cells are about the same size. And within certain bounds, the individual cells have much the same energy demands simply to stay alive. simply to perform the normal functions that maintain cell health. So there is a certain maintenance level of metabolism, and that we refer to as the basal metabolism, the basal metabolic rate. If the organism then is to do other things, if the organism is to move, predate, reproduce, all of those activities demand more energy, and those, in order to provide that energy, the metabolic rate has to be raised. So there are metabolic demands which come to be placed on the organism over and above its basal metabolic rate. So in the endotherms, especially in the mammals, the maintenance of body temperature is regulated by an area of the brain called the hypothalamus. Here it is here. It's actually, the hypothalamus is almost like a funnel. It has a cavity in the center, but it is pyramidal. There you can see it there. It's very closely associated with another gland called the pituitary, which is there. It's called the hypothalamus because above it, there's an area of the brain called the thalamus. But the hypothalamus is our most important sensor in the brain. And it monitors lots of things. But one of its most important functions is to sense heat, to sense the heat, the temperature of the blood passing through it and past it. And it is the hypothalamus which responds to rise or fall in blood temperature by stimulating different metabolic processes. Now, there are some special circumstances under which the set point can actually be raised. Now, our set point is normally around 37 degrees Celsius, but it can be raised by the hypothalamus. And this is a condition which we probably all know well, of fever. Fever is a response of the body usually to infection. And the set point of metabolism is raised above 37 degrees Celsius. And there's an important reason for that. That is that many pathogens are adapted to reproduce at 37 degrees Celsius, and they don't do as well. We can survive being raised above 37 degrees for a certain period of time, as long as it is not too much. But pathogens are impeded by that rise in temperature. So it slows their reproduction and allows our immune system to get the upper hand. There is a problem associated with that, though, and that is that if we raise temperature too high, the thalamus itself, its ability to monitor the set point, is damaged, and the metabolism may continue to increase, and the temperature may continue to increase to really dangerous levels. And this is a critical situation because in an endotherm, all of the tissues are adapted to a very close range of temperature, and they are easily damaged if the temperature rises too high. Now, also to remind you, ectotherms also like to maintain a constant body temperature, but they do not have these extensive control mechanisms that we do, and instead they have to rely on behavioral mechanisms in order to maintain a constant body temperature. So here are the responses again, which the hypothalamus governs, and it governs these responses by hormonal means. So this is a typical system of perception and then eliciting a response from the body. The normal body temperature between 36 and 38, around about 37. If the hypothalamus perceives that the body temperature is rising too high, it has two principal effects that it gets in response to release of hormones. The first is the dilation of blood vessels in the face and the hands especially, so that we radiate more heat. The second is to stimulate sweat, to stimulate sweating. In response to falling temperature, if the blood temperature begins to fall too much, then the opposite happens in the face and the hands, especially. It happens in other blood vessels in the skin, but it's predominantly in the face and hands. The blood vessels will actually contract. That will direct blood to the core. But the other is to produce shivering. And the third response, not included in this diagram, is that the metabolism is increased. So that is non-shivering thermogenesis. So when we look at the animal kingdom, we observe some different, some particular phenomena, some particular associations of metabolism and size. If we go, these diagrams are at first glance may be a little bit difficult to understand, because it looks like they're trying to tell you the same thing if you look at the axes. But I'll point out that this diagram here is telling us the basal metabolic rate for the whole animal. So it's by weight of the entire organism. This one here is showing us basal metabolic rate per unit of weight. And we see some very interesting things. First of all, look where we go. We go from an elephant, which is a huge animal, to a shrew, which is one of the smallest of the mammals. And when we look at this diagram here, we see a straight line. That means that the basal metabolic rate per kilogram of weight of animal is a constant. The reason that it's so high here is because the elephant is enormous. The reason it's so low here is because the shrew is extremely small. The way to think about this is the shrew and the elephant are made up of cells, right? There are far more in the elephant than there are in the shrew. They're about the same size, each cell. And each cell's demands, shown here, are about the same. So it's the reason that there's such a high overall demand in the elephant, the reason that the basal metabolic rate here needs to be so much higher is because the elephant's size is so much greater. But it's extremely interesting that this is a straight line. When this is plotted on a log-log scale, it is a straight line. So now that's the one way to think about it. The other way to think about it, though, is we have to think about the basal metabolic rate per unit of body mass. Is there actually a difference when we look at how much those shrew cells are demanding and how much the elephant cells are demanding? And the answer is yes, there is. And this is a semi-log scale. Okay, log there and arithmetic there. What we see now is that the shrew's demands are much, much higher. The metabolic rate of the shrew overall is incredibly high. That of the large animals, the elephant, is relatively low. There's an important reason for this. A shrew has a very high metabolic rate because its heat loss for its small body size, its heat loss is enormous. It has to maintain a high basal metabolic rate to maintain a constant body temperature. The elephant does not. In fact, the elephant with its huge mass has the opposite problem. It is very difficult as a very large animal to shed that heat. Even the mechanisms of evaporative cooling, panting, etc., are insufficient because the surface area to volume ratio is so different. The surface area to volume ratio in the shrew is very high. it's very low in the elephant. And the basal metabolic rate of the individual cells is in fact lower in the elephant than it is in the shrew. Okay, so do please go to these quick quizzes and work out which of these animals, for example, in this diagram, who do you think expends more energy in kilocalories per year? That's the yearly metabolic rate on maintaining their internal body temperature. It should be pretty obvious. Who, for example, lives in the coldest environment? Same thing. What about activity? When we budget for activity, who spends most energy actually maintaining their activity in the environment? Okay, so just to finish off, there are mechanisms, even in the endotherms, whereby energy can be conserved and by special mechanisms. And the first is actually a system called, it applies through universally, called torpor. And torpor is a physiological state of decreased activity and metabolism, but not necessarily just in response to lowered temperature. It can also be in response to raised temperature, as I'll explain in a minute. In many of those small animals, the shrews, things like a hummingbird, these sorts of things, while it is true that they radiate out heat tremendously under cold circumstances because of their high surface area to volume ratio, correspondingly, under very high temperatures, they find it very, very difficult to cool down. And one of the things that small organisms like that do is in the heat of the day, for example, they will shut down their metabolism. They will go into a state of very low activity. And that is a system called torpor. When it is in response to temperature, if it extends for a long time, as it does sometimes in desert animals and things like this, we refer to it as estivation. The opposite of estivation is hibernation. Hibernation is also a form of torpor, but it is a response it is a response to cold. And in hibernation, the metabolic rate is actually shut down by the hypothalamus. It is drastically lowered, and the metabolism can fall as much as 20 times lower than normal. And animals do this in various ways. Some animals, such as the very small animals like dormice and those sort of things, they hibernate. They go into a very long period of complete inactivity for much of the winter. And they simply do not respond to stimulus under those circumstances. If you pick them up, they just stay as they are. Other organisms like bears have an intermediate kind of, they do undergo torpor. They do lower their metabolic rate to a certain extent, but their hibernation is much more akin to deep sleep. They will respond, in fact, to stimulus. And also, they will respond throughout the winter. The system of hibernation and things like bears, they do not undergo this constant state of unconscious lowering of the metabolism. Okay, so that is that. And then I will see you on Monday.